distinguished guests, honorable colleagues, I would also like to warmly welcome you to this important web parliamentary dialogue exploring the contributions of parliamentarians and journalists in fighting corruption. But first, please, let me ask my colleagues to broadcast a short message from our beloved President, George Tsereteli, who might also join us later. Many thanks to George for his kind words and unconditional trust.
I'd like to take this opportunity and time to salute the efforts of our special representative on fighting corruption, our dear colleague and friend, Ειρήνη Χαραλαμπίδου, in organizing this event together with support from the OSCE PA's International Secretary. I also want to welcome all our expert guests today. And let me note the good cooperation we have enjoyed with Professor Paolo Severino in recent years. I also want to highlight Ms. Charalabidu's efforts to promote closer relations between the OSCE and GRECO, and thanks to its Executive Secretary, Mr. Esposito, for joining us today. I think and I'm sure that we'll have good discussions, interesting ideas to exchange. This gives us a very good opportunity to underline the key partnerships that both we, parliamentarians and journalists, must play to promote good governance in support of security and stability in the OSCE area. I hope we can also identify and support ways our Parliamentary Assembly can assist these efforts. So thank you for your attention, and I wish you very interesting and fruitful web dialogue today.
Thank you, dear George. And now the floor goes briefly to our Secretary General, Roberto Modella, who would also like to greet us. Roberto, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, dear Irene. Let me congratulate you and Marco for setting up this webinar on a very important issue. But let me first congratulate you, Irene, personally for your energy, your passion and expertise that you bring on this very important topic. Indeed, I would like to welcome all the participants to this event. I see is one of the most successful events we've had with lots of participants. There's a lot of interest on this issue. Indeed, fighting corruption is a top priority of the OSCE governmental side as well as the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. And thanks to your arrival in our assembly, Irene, you've brought it very much at the center of debates, and for this I am particularly grateful to you personally. But as this is the first time also that we have as guests of a webinar journalists, normally journalists could always connect through our YouTube channel or Facebook, but this time they are part of our seminar. I'd like to particularly thank the journalists who participate in this event, also because journalists help us being in check. You know, they help monitoring what parliamentarians do, but also civil servants like us. So thank you very much for your contribution, and to all the journalists who are participating in this event. As you know, in the OSCE region, we have a lot of challenges in this moment. There are many hot topics in the OSCE agenda, and I can see that many of the participants to this event are also in a challenging situation back home in their countries. So I would like to make an appeal to all the participants really to use this event, to use this webinar to focus on the discussion that we have focused on here. We are talking about corruption, and let's keep our focus on that, and let's not use this event to discuss about other issues, which of course are very hot, and we will of course discuss these issues in a separate event if it happens that participants want to participate in some kind of event discussing the frozen conflicts that we are within the OSCE, or not so much frozen in this moment. But please, I really appeal to all participants to keep this webinar focused on the issue of corruption. With those words, I also authorize Marco, maybe if you have challenges during the day, to also be more forceful in your moderating the event, and and making sure that we all stick to the agenda item. Thank you very much again, Marco, for guiding us through this event, and Irene, congratulations on the big participation and again on putting corruption at the center of the OSCE debate. Thank you all for working us.
Thank you very much, Garo Roberto. We do count on your support, always. At this point, allow me to personally commend our guest speakers for their courageous anti-corruption efforts, because you need to be very brave to tackle grand corruption. The system will always fight you back, find new malicious ways to undermine the credibility of your work, often even threaten your life and those of your dear ones. There are many stark reminders of the risks involved in this line of work. For instance, the extreme sacrifice Mr. Jan Kuciak and Mrs. Martina Kushnirova, who were gunned down cold-blooded in Bratislava in February 2018. Paula, Gianluca, Odissea, Drew, and Franz, we are truly honored to have you with us today. Thank you for your time and for sharing your personal experience with all of us. Dear colleagues, corruption hampers our democracies, curbs development, weakens the rule of law, and undermines stability in our countries. It affects all sectors of society and represents an imminent threat to our security, especially as it proliferates across international borders. Both parliamentarians and journalists work in the interest of the public when providing oversight, investigating and reporting corruptive practices among state and non-state officials, formal and informal structures of power, and internal and external circles of influence. When we join forces, we can more successfully prevent abuses and uncover scandals, ultimately reinforcing citizens' trust in our institutions, in our way of doing business, as well as in the work of free and independent media. I firmly believe that our roles are mutually reinforcing. In exercising our duties, we are boosting transparency, probably the most important single precondition to prevent grand corruption. At the end of the day, it all goes down to transparency. Transparency of our political systems, transparency of our public systems, transparency of our economic systems, and transparency of our financial systems. On the one hand, the parliamentarians, we mandate to create pertinent anti-corruption legislation, empower independent institutions and law enforcement, promote media freedom, scrutinize the work of our governments, and adopt effective internal regulations to prevent corruption among our own ranks. On the other, journalists play a vital role in fostering a culture of accountability in our political systems by uncovering and publicly exposing malpractices and by fighting impunity. Al Jazeera investigative units' recent work into the so-called golden passport scandal in my own country represents a case in point. Similarly, the 2016 so-called Panama Papers grew out of a 5-year reporting pushed by the International Consortium of Investigating Journalists that dug into financial secrecy heavens. The 2016 Unaoil corruption and bribery scandal in the oil industry is yet another good example. And the list goes on and on and on. Of course, for media to play an effective role in this context, journalists must be free and independent, and the media environment needs to be pluralistic, safe, and protected from undue state or private influence. It is only in such an environment that journalists can retain their public information function and actively contribute to curb corruption. Unfortunately, this is not easy to achieve. For instance, a research conducted by Transparency International this year shows that on average, every week, at least one journalist is killed in a country that is considered highly corrupt, and 1 in 5 journalists die while covering a story about corruption. These numbers, dear colleagues, are extremely worrying and should concern us all. I hope that their courage, work, and sacrifice will not be in vain, and I promise to personally commit to bring these issues to light. Dear participants, in the context of our debate today, I would like to bring to highlight a few issues which I deem critical. First, protecting whistleblowers, informing or even leaking information to law enforcement officials, the media and the public about experienced corruptive practices, so-called whistleblowing, should not be punishable by law. In fact, quite the contrary. Strong legal frameworks should be developed to protect the identity and safety of citizens, journalists, and politicians who have the courage to expose corruption. This is why I have introduced a special bill on this very topic before my Parliament, which I hope will adopt it soon. Second, media ownership needs to be 100% transparent. Public information is simply too important to leave the matter unregulated in our countries. This is to avoid the creation of excessive concentration or even monopolies of media, which would limit pluralism of information and hamper our democracies. Citizens have a right to know who owns all the newspapers, TV channels, radio, and online portals they follow. Third, the influence of editors, publishers, and state bodies on investigative journalists should be limited to the bare minimum. Journalists should be encouraged to pursue their own investigations independently, responsibly, and exclusively in the interest of the public. The goal should always be to uncover corruption wherever it resides, rather than to attack one political side or the other, depending on the editor's affiliation, and we've seen that many times. Media freedom is an incredible asset in fighting corruption. Fourth, I believe that politicians should be more proactive in regulating issues such as conflict of interest, transparency in party financing and lobbying practices. Perceptions of corruption in the political system have been consistent, signaling a systematic citizens' mistrust in the bodies that are supposed to represent them. In this regard, the adoption of well-conceived codes of conduct could also help to build an atmosphere of credibility and ethics. For parliamentarians, they offer clear and much-needed guidance on do's and don'ts. For citizens, they represent a reference point based on which they can assess our behavior. Lastly, I agree with Marco that it is impossible to avoid relating to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, which has greatly influenced our everyday lives. With unprecedented amounts of public funds being pumped into the economy, for emergency spending measures, it is essential to ensure that strong transparency and anti-corruption guarantees are in place and fully operational. In addition, some governments are tempted to use the pretext of the health crisis for tightening restrictions on media and jailing reporters for misinformation. This is unacceptable and place in favor of corruption. Finally, the economic crisis fueled by the pandemic has threatened the very existence of several media outlets, that's exposing the press to even greater external pressure from those who finance it. In conclusion, while moving towards a corruption-free society in a burdensome and often discouraging process, it is truly the only way. Fighting corruption must remain at top of priorities in all our countries. Our citizens demand that. I now look forward to hearing more from our distinguished guests as from all our fellow participants. Thank you. And now, dear colleagues, I'm pleased to introduce our keynote speakers, whose contribution to our debate, I'm confident, will be invaluable. Unfortunately, Professor Paola Severino will not be able to join us today due to unforeseen circumstances. However, she has prepared a short video message for us, which we're going to watch in a bit. Well known to the OSCE, Professor Paola Severino is the special representative of the OSCE chairperson in office on combating corruption. She is also the vice president of Louis University in Rome, professor of criminal law and president of Louis School of Law. Throughout her career, she has placed special emphasis on the fight against corruption in all its forms. In her capacity as Minister of Justice in 2012, she introduced groundbreaking new anti-corruption provisions before the Italian Parliament. I would kindly ask my colleagues from the International Secretariat to play Professor Severino's video now. Thank you, guys.
Good afternoon. Let me begin by expressing my sincere gratitude to the organizers of this parliamentary web dialogue on the crucial issue of the partnership between parliamentarians and journalists in the fight against corruption. I would like to thank particularly the OSCE Special Representative on Fighting Corruption, Honorable Ειρήνη Χαραλαμπίδου, for her praiseworthy commitment on her mandate and kind spirit of cooperation in promoting a stronger role of the OSCE in combating corruption and supporting good governance. Today's web dialogue takes place at a critical juncture for the joint commitment of the OSCE participating states and partners to combating corruption and enhancing public governance institutions. We are living a time of exceptional and unpredictable circumstances, ones that are exerting an enormous pressure and much strain on the public governance systems. Such a predicament is raising worries on the resilience of public governance in the face of risks of instability against the growing public demand for quick and efficient responses in terms of provision of services and public spending. Indeed, preserving the sustainability of our governance structure stands out as a most urgent task for all our countries. However, while we should remain vigilant on the actual risks posed by the magnitude of the challenges ahead of us, we should also try and balance any such grim scenario of demise with the call to take up instead the opportunity offered by the crisis to expedite the modernization of our public governance systems alongside a strong reaffirmation of their main pillars and tenets. I am referring to the need of leveraging on the severe constraints posed by the crisis to apply and extend measures of simplification of rules and procedures in a renewed effort to foster collective responsibility and a culture of integrity between citizens and government toward the formulation of a new social compact. I am referring particularly to a call for promoting a participatory approach among parliament, government, civil society, business community, and media to foster citizens' trust and social consensus on non-tolerance of corruption. Parliamentarians being elected by citizens are the first line in building the new social compact, promoting a corruption-free environment and pushing for legislative initiatives addressing the public expectation for modern, effective, and accountable public governance institutions. Media are equally crucial in this endeavor, both in their traditional role of watchdog in the shortcoming of our public governance ecosystem and in that increasingly important of agent of positive change in the process of modernization of the public governance tools and institutions. The role of journalists and media has been greatly enhanced by the digital transformation of our societies. They represent a relevant resource to be leveraged upon on our quest for building trust and a solid culture of transparency and accountability in our societies, particularly to the benefit of younger generations, themselves a powerful agent in preventing corruption and raising public awareness about corruption and the damage it causes to the well-functioning of democratic institutions. We all remember how important was in the so-called Velvet Revolutions the role of young people. The magnitude of the COVID crisis and the global attitude of its reach has brought along the need to reaffirm the importance of international cooperation and multilateral approach as the most effective way to prevent and react to global threats. The Albanian OSCE chairmanship has set the fight against corruption as one of its priorities. Indeed, the call for international cooperation in the domain of the fight against corruption has resounded clearly and vividly during the OSCE Anti-Corruption Conference in July and again on the occasion of the OSCE Prague Forum last month. Today's event stands out as a further significant confirmation that the OSCE, both in its intergovernmental and interparliamentary articulations, remains uniquely placed to counter the spread of corruption through enhanced international cooperation and by virtue of its holistic approach to counter this security threat. I wish you all a fruitful discussion and exchange. Thank you.
Many thanks to Professor Severino for her readiness to contribute to this initiative despite not being able to attend in person. We greatly value her work within the OSCE and we look forward to our continued cooperation. Personally, I see Professor Severino as a source of inspiration in this field, and I will gladly partner with her on developing a new social compact against corruption. I would also like to thank her, stressing the relevance of media and youth in this context. Our first live speaker is Mr. Gianluca Esposito. As the Executive Secretary of GRECO, he monitors member states' compliance with and effective implementation of the Council of Europe anti-corruption standards. In 2019, he was nominated as the first ethics officer of the Council of Europe. Prior to this post, Gianluca held several positions at the Council of Europe since 1995 and has acted as a senior counsel in the legal department of the International Monetary Fund in Washington from 2009 to 2015. Dear Gianluca, Thanks again for accepting our invitation despite your busy agenda. I know how busy you are. I'm curious to learn about your forward-looking proposals. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Irene. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I hope everybody can hear me well. If you don't, just interrupt me. Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to start, dear Irene, by thanking you very much for initiating this important event and for inviting me here. Knowing your background, I knew that this was a topic very dear to your heart, and in your introductory remarks, you actually made that very, very clear. I have to share and to agree with you on the fact that this is a very important topic because parliamentarians and journalists actually do play a key role in preventing and combating corruption. Whilst they have their own focus, they both, parliamentarians and journalists, serve the public and have a number of elements in common in relation to anti-corruption. So let me try to highlight 5 of them from the perspective of the Council of Europe Group of States Against Corruption, the GRECO, which, as you know, covers today 50 member states. That is basically the whole of geographical Europe, plus the United States and Kazakhstan. The first element that I would like to highlight that is in common, in my view, between members of parliament and journalists is that they both should lead by example. And for members of parliament to be credible in their anti-corruption effort, they have to show and behave with the necessary integrity and ethics. In line with our recommendations, they should, for instance, have a code of conduct that should be enforced. And you yourself, Irene, just mentioned that. There should be rules and regulations about how to manage conflict of interest, relationship with lobbyists, gifts, what happens after an MP has finished the parliamentarian job, what about incompatibilities. These and many others are important preventive tools that would help parliamentarians show the example of ethics and integrity. Now, I have to say, Irene, you know that I speak always very openly. I have to say that for the GRECO member states, at the end of last year, the recommendations that we issued to parliamentarians, they were the least implemented. Regrettably, only 26% of them have been implemented, and that is too little. Unfortunately, that actually contributes to a lack of interest, distance of our citizens with politics and political institutions. In my view, we should expect nothing less than exemplarity from public office holders, including the parliamentarians. On the other hand, protecting freedom of expression and promoting a safe environment for journalists is a priority for the Council of Europe and is also key to the fight against corruption. As you have indicated, journalists shed light on corrupt practices and improve accountability. And I would like to pay tribute to the many journalists who risked their lives and to those who lost it simply because they were doing their job. Just as an aside, I just wanted also to draw your attention to a publication that was published only this morning by the Council of Europe, which is why I'm raising it. It's a book called A Mission to Inform, Journalists at Risk Speak Out. And it is a book that represents the sort of one-on-one interviews with 20 investigative journalists from 18 of our member states. It is really a book worth reading. Now, journalists, of course, also, like members of parliament, need to lead by example. For their voice to be credible and respected, journalists have to be independent, accurate, and truthful in their reporting. There should be no place for corruption of any kind in the media itself. The second element that I think is in common between parliamentarians and journalists is that their work both boosts accountability. Members of parliament are instrumental in keeping governments accountable for promoting anti-corruption reforms, for implementing preventive and repressive measures. The parliamentarians should play an active role in promoting legislation, in pushing for the implementation of the international standards at the national level. So they do have a role to sort of keep governments to account for their actions. On the other side, as transparency is key to accountability, journalists reporting may uncover corrupt practices and bring them to the attention of the competent authorities. Journalists reporting on the evaluation of the international anti-corruption monitoring bodies like GRECO generate very big sometimes actually large national debates, which in turn trigger positive change. So both members of parliament and journalists, I think, boost accountability at different levels. The third element that I think there is in common between parliamentarians and journalists is that, as far as we are concerned in Greco, they contribute very directly to our work. During our on-site visits, as you know, Irene, we, Greco, don't work behind the desk. We go in the field, we go on-site to evaluate countries' compliance with our standards. When we go on-site, we meet members of parliaments from all political sides. And that gives us a very good picture of the situation in any given country. Similarly, when we go on site, we meet journalists, not to answer questions, but to ask questions. And in many cases, the information that we receive from journalists have directly informed our reports. In fact, when the connection between corruption and the work of journalists is very close, we've also raised this issue directly in our evaluations of certain member states. I'm not going to mention the member states, however, the evaluations are public, so it's very easy to identify them. The fourth element that I think is in common between members of parliament and journalists is that they both play a role in maintaining high quality journalism. You have referred to that as well earlier in your intervention, and also Professor Severino touched upon that. Well, it's clear that the internet and digital technology have multiplied the number of news sources that are available to the public, changing our collective consumption habits. There is an abundance of news sources that has, however, not guaranteed a better quality or diverse information. And at the same time, it has also hit traditional quality media that is struggling to remain financially sustainable. The impact of social media and of manipulative websites is also causing concern about the quality of the information that is reaching the public. And in this context, the role of quality journalism remains crucial for democratic society by serving the public interest and promoting accountability in the public life. On the other side, it is, of course, also members of parliament's job to contribute to quality journalism, irrespective of the political affiliation. My fifth and last point is about the protection of whistleblowers. And again, Irene, you touched upon that. I do think, and I feel very strongly about that, I think that whistleblowers play a very, very important role in the area of anti-corruption. In the last 20-25 years, we have made huge progress in the protection of whistleblowers. We are certainly not there where we should be, but we are better than where we were. And this is a topic that is very high on the Council of Europe, on the Greco agenda. Together with the European Union, I think we in the Council of Europe, we probably have the most advanced standards in this area that has been made even more advanced by our evaluation. This work should continue, and both members of parliament and journalists are instrumental in protecting whistleblowers and in providing a safe environment for them. So with that, Irene, I hope I've highlighted the five, I think, and they're not the only ones actually, but the five elements that I see in common between members of parliament and journalists, and how they both can play within their respective spheres of work a very important role in preventing and combating corruption. And I look forward to the discussion and to any questions that participants may have. Thank you very much again for inviting me.
Dear Gianluca, thank you so much. As I said before, it's an honor you are here today with us. We thank you for your insightful presentation. Council of Europe's and Greco's guidance in this domain is extremely critical. From your advantaged observation point, you can more easily connect the dots and coordinate our anti-corruption efforts. So we always appreciate the help you give to us. But from what you've said, there is so much room for improvement, so much room. Thank you. Dr. Odysseas Michailidis is our next speaker for today. In 2014, he was appointed Auditor General by the President of the Republic of Cyprus. Dr. Michailidis has held several positions within the Ministry of Communications and Work, including the Director of Control dealing with public procurement issues, with the examination of contractors' claims, as well as with technical and financial audit work. He has also given several lectures in Cyprus and abroad on public procurement. Dr. Michailidis, I'm keen to hear your views and understand the ways in which the independent institutions help to identify and tackle corruption in many different countries, and how these activities relate to the contribution that politicians and journalists should make to the global fight against corruption. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Irene. Excellent. Express my gratitude to the organizers for the honor to be a speaker in this event, and of course, let me thank you for the inspirer of this event. I think that besides your active role against corruption, your introductory speech ensures that the event, the webinar, will be fruitful and interesting. I intend to use some slides to make the presentation more easy. Let me try to, I think that's the way. Give me a minute. Okay. Yes. Can you see the slides? It's okay?
Yes, we can see it clearly. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay. So we are the audit office of the Republic of Cyprus, meaning that the supreme audit institution of Cyprus, OSCE, our global organization. Of course, besides of providing neutral support to SAIS and federal, sets standards for public sector auditing, and the most fundamental standard is the so-called Lehman Declaration, the Magna Carta of government auditing. This standard, Lehman Declaration, it is explained that the concept and establishment of audit is inherent in public financial administration, as the management of public funds represent, as you all understand, a trust. The importance of audit, we can say, is an indispensable part of a regulatory system, whose aim is to uncover violations of the principles of legality, efficiency, effectiveness, and economy. The last three is the so-called 3 E's that we use in the performance audits. 2,500 years ago, Plato summarized the principles of auditing as a means of public accountability. The two basic auditing principles mentioned by Plato are still in force today. It's transparency and, of course, independency of the auditing body. Now let's talk about the role of SAI in fighting corruption. SAI, as I said, is a supreme audit institution. It should be noted that the prevention of fraud and corruption and their discovery is neither the responsibility nor the primary of an external auditor. This primary responsibility rests with those charged with the governance and the management of the auditee. So, if the auditor identifies a fraud, the international standards require the auditor, we have to say it's not a choice, it's a requirement, to communicate these matters in a timely manner to the appropriate level of management. And the auditor should also determine whether there is a responsibility to report the occurrence or suspicion of fraud to the prosecuting. Fraud and corruption thrive when transparency and accountability are absent. This, being a fundamental institution for promoting transparency, contribute to the prevention of fraud through transparency and the created fraud alert. So what about the relationship of a SAI with the Parliament? According to Lehman Declaration, the fundamental standard that I said before, the independence of a SAI shall guarantee a very high degree of initiative and autonomy. SAIs report their findings to the Parliament. The reports shall be published, and this will ensure extensive distribution and discussion. And of course, this brings to the surface the role of the media and the journalists in the fight against corruption. In 2017, OECD issued a paper that deals with the relationship between SAIs and parliaments, which are the two most important players for holding government to account, as you said before, Irene and Gianluca. Let's see the accountability triangle. Parliament adopts the state budget and authorizes the executive referral on the line between the two. The executive reports on the implementation of the budget to Parliament. SAI, in line with its mandate, you see the word, audits the budget implementation and reports to Parliament, and the Parliament, on behalf of the citizens, holds the executive to account. It's the word control. The foundation of the relationship between SAIs and parliaments are the audit reports that SAIs send to the Parliament. The establishment of good working relationships between SAIs and parliaments is very important in order to increase the attention parliaments pay to SAI reports. SAIs have, of course, a lot to do concerning the quality of their reports, but parliamentarians also play an important role for the utilization of SAIs reports. Many parliaments in Europe have developed relevant procedures. Good practices examples involve development of standard procedures for parliamentary discussion on SAI reports that makes timely conclusions possible, organization of hearings with auditees, requiring action plans from the executive, from government, and setting deadlines for measures to be taken, and considering sanctions in cases of serious non-compliance with recommendations from the SAI, etc. Parliamentarians could consider these good practices and see whether improvements of the current framework in their country could be implemented towards that procedure. Audit or Accounts Committee, usually known as Public Accounts Committee, let's call it PAC, is one of the methods parliaments can choose for dealing with SAIs reports. What has to be decided by a parliament is the powers and resources of PAC and how the PAC deals with information provided by SAI. Sigma organization suggests that a PAC should, when possible, act in a non-political way, have a member of an opposition party as committee chair, have suitable staff support, etc., as you see in the slide. Again, these are actions to be taken by parliamentarians. A minimum expectation is that parliaments have formal mechanisms for considering SAI reports. Now, media is the fundamental channel for keeping citizens informed of the SAI's role and for their reports, and safeguard transparency, which, as we saw, is the lethal weapon against corruption. Properly informed citizens will create public pressure on elected representatives, is the parliamentarians, which in turn will lead to greater executive accountability. In countries like Cyprus, have a presidential system where the executive is elected and is not responsible to the parliament, citizens create direct pressure on executive. So what is important is the audit message to be well and effectively communicated, and this burden lies on the shoulders of journalists. We saw before the accountability triangle. I put it in small scale on the left side of the slide. In this triangle, citizens are not mentioned, but of course, Parliament represents the citizens. For this to be true and to be the case, media play a key role. So effective media contribute to the good functioning of the accountability system. The other figure in large scale shows the interaction of media with citizens, the executive, those that have the power, and the accountability institutions like courts. Free and independent media is the fourth cornerstone of a democracy. An independent media sector is conceptualized as one part of a system of accountability that helps mitigate corruption and misrule. The responsibility of journalists to protect media freedom is huge. parliamentarians are also responsible for ensuring an enabling environment that facilitates independent media and ensures the right of citizens to freely express their opinions. State support to media is often necessary and has gained added prominence in the context of the emerging good governance agenda. This report that I mentioned, there is a link at the bottom of the slide, explains the proper ways that such state support could be implemented in order to avoid corrosion of media independence. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Michailidis, for your thought-provoking words. Indeed, the contribution of independent institutions is pivotal in the global fight against corruption. Clearly, your tools are different from those of parliamentarians and journalists, but possibly even more critical. Thanks also for highlighting the so-called accountability triangle and for stressing the critical role of media. Mr. Drew Sullivan, co-founder and publisher of the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, well known as OSCE, a global network of 40 investigative reporting centers, media and networks, is our fourth speaker for today. Under his direction, OSCE has won numerous awards, including the OSCE's work on the Panama Papers with the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, which won a 2017 Pulitzer Prize in Journalism. He is an investigative journalist who has worked for almost a decade in Eastern Europe and Eurasia. In addition, he founded and edited the Center of Investigative Reporting, the leading investigative center in Bosnia-Herzegovina. Dear Mr. Sullivan, I now look forward to hearing about your impressive journalistic work on uncovering and reporting corruption-related cases and scandals in the OSCE region. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for having me here today. Investigative reporting is a key lever in combating corruption, and we at OCCRP expose and explain the relationship between money and power, which serves as a catalyst that arms others with the information needed to drive change. As investigative journalists, we expose crime and corruption at the highest levels. Using these revelations, advocates can press for of policy and package the information for law enforcement, which has the authority to act on evidence and deliver justice. Policymakers can point to investigative findings to pass legislation and advance reforms. Citizens who read our work get the information they need to vote, to act, and to organize on their own behalf. To do our job, there's many things that we need, and we're not really truly getting them. So I want to talk a little bit about some of those things that make journalism effective. First of all, there is transparency. It's been mentioned before, but I want to go back to it because it's so important. We know that sunshine is really the best disinfectant, both for COVID and for corruption. And we need to make a recommitment to freedom of information. Many countries are backsliding in the EU, and frequently we do basic information that we need. Records that should be public records are not available because governments refuse to give them out. Without this basic information, we cannot act as the fourth estate. We cannot do our job as journalists, and we open our countries to corruption and to misuse of public funds, which is a serious problem. We also need provisions in those laws to protect the anonymity of journalists and whistleblowers. It's not unusual for us to file a Freedom of Information request and to get a call back from an organized crime figure who wants to know what we're looking for and what we're working on, which is a very difficult and frustrating experience when you're trying to keep that information out of their hands in the first place. I want to talk about a very important issue for us as investigative journalists, and that's ultimate beneficial ownership. And I bring this issue up now because we are in a situation where this is being actively considered by the EU. We have a right to know who's doing business in our countries. We mandate that the public have passports and identifications, but we don't ask for the same information from companies. Often they can come in, open up shop, and operate in our countries without so much as saying who the owner is. And that's a serious problem because it leads to liability. You have bad acting countries coming in, taking out loans, polluting water, and causing all sorts of problems. And it ends up that the ownership is some 87-year-old proxy in Ukraine, which we have found on occasion, and you'd never be able to get to the true owner. This is a serious problem. It's also empowering organized crime and corruption. Corruption and crime that has pulled money from other states to the EU, and then can set up shop and operate with the protections of the rule of law, where they misuse those same protections in their own countries. And a lot of these, and the other thing is the allowance of offshore companies to come in and own businesses or to buy assets or to buy real estate. Offshore countries should be required to register locally and provide information who their ultimate beneficial owner is. We should not allow these organizations to operate in our country. And this has been all across the political spectrum, this is being taken as a much more severe issue than it has been in the past. And in fact, this is a national security issue. Profoundly undemocratic money is moving from the East, from China and from other countries into parts of Europe. And often this money is supporting nationalist, anti-democratic, or extremist parties, causing problems for us. We should not be allowing this to happen. There is historic momentum in places like the United States and in the EU right now to pass these laws. And in fact, the United States, for the first time, has made UBO laws part of the National Defense Authorization Act, which is an unusual step. We need these strong rules and enforcement of them. And there is a recent open data directive. The EU is considering now definitions of company ownership. And they've broken these down into two options, the high option and the low option. The high option makes UBO and other basic information on management a public record. It gives important information of how the company is operating, who owns it, and who is managing it. Critically, the low option does not. And it is the low option that appears to be winning and has stronger support right now in the EU. This would be a grave mistake, and it guarantees future interference in elections in the EU and forces working not only to split up the EU, as we saw in Brexit, but also to create more plutocratic laws in these countries. The high data option must be implemented if we are going to be able to fight corruption. We also need to regulate what we call the criminal services industry. Criminal services are the banks, the law firms, the company registration agents, hedge funds, real estate firms, and others who cater to organized crime and corruption. We have rules on banks that they have to know their customers, but whole other asset classes have no such rules, including real estate, hedge funds, and even cryptocurrency accounts. We need better disclosure of this information if we're going to be able to track bad money and we're able to counter it. We also need better disclosure of party financing. Party financing is a black hole in which many funds go into, but the true owners, the true contributors are never really found. And this is a serious problem in reporting in many parts of the EU. Finally, journalism safety is a huge issue to us as journalists. We believe strongly that there should be in the EU some mechanism to allow for independent investigations of the murder of journalists and other political murders. We know that 97% of all masterminds behind the crimes are never revealed in these journalism murders. And in EU countries, we know that many of the justice systems are highly politicized right now, in which case we cannot expect that the true ultimate person who ordered the murder of the journalist is determined. We need independent checks on these investigations to verify that the local investigations are being done correctly and are done well. Journalists are really the canaries in the coal mine. We're being murdered, but now because we are revealing the truth. But if revealing the truth is getting us murdered, then other things will get people murdered for other reasons, including justice officials, politicians, and even members of parliament. This is potentially a serious problem, and unless there is a mechanism to truly get to the bottom of political murders, these will continue to be an effective means of controlling journalists and other people in the future. We also need anti-SLAPP legislation. Journalists are facing serious difficulties, losses. OCCRP currently has 17 various legal threats, including 4 from the Republic of Cyprus, against journalists right now, trying to prevent us from telling the stories or to punish us from telling these stories. Often these are coming from lawyers themselves. There should be a burden that the plaintiff has to show that there's a probability that they will prevail in a lawsuit. And they should be punished and they should be made to pay if they arbitrarily sue journalists just as a harassment technique. It is possible to sue a journalism organization across the globe simultaneously for a story in 10, 12, or even 15 jurisdictions, which would put most journalism organizations in a very difficult situation and even put their very survival at risk. This is being allowed. We must stop that. We need better laws to protect journalists from these types of libel and privacy cases. Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear Drew, for your very interesting presentation. It's clear that no lawsuit is going to stop you, hopefully. I know, I'm sure of that. It clearly showed some of the challenges, your speech, that you journalists faced in this risky business, but it also a testament to the courage, dedication, and commitment of your team. Thanks you again, and we have to keep in touch. Our last speaker for today is Mr. Franz Wild, the editor of the Bureau of Investigative Journalism's Enablers Project. Franz spent 13 years as a reporter for Bloomberg, covering everything from politics to economics and mining in West, Central and Southern Africa, as well as London. He has led investigations into grand corruption, fraud, insider trading, and everything in between. He has won several prizes for his work, including the British Journalism Awards, and was called and was a Gerald Loeb Award finalist. Authorities in the UK, US, and elsewhere have opened criminal investigations into some of his subjects after his articles were published. Dear Mr. Weil, I really look forward to hearing your insights on your critical contribution to the global fight against corruption. The floor is yours, please.
Hi, good afternoon, and thanks for inviting me. It's really great to be part of this. Just a little bit of a more background based on the introduction. You know, some of the subjects I've investigated from all over the world. So I was based in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in South Africa, in London, in Ivory Coast. And this really is a truly global problem. And I would, first of all, I'd very much echo all of the things literally that Drew said, because I think he had a really vast sweep. I would just sort of want to double down specifically on sort of regulation of professional services and, you know, resourcing of enforcement. I think the FinCEN files, the biggest thing that we learned from that is less that there's lots of dirty money flowing through the system, but more that enforcement is wholly lacking. And that is, first and foremost, a resourcing issue. Resourcing, in turn, is a political issue. And until that gets sorted out, I think we can expect very little. From a journalism perspective, transparency really is an absolute must, and there needs to be greater access to what enforcement operations are doing. Without that, I mean, you know, Drew mentioned freedom of information requests. Here in the UK, for example, it's incredibly difficult to get information based on that. Often it takes a very, very long time, and then you kind of get very little back. I want to focus particularly on the freedom of journalists to operate. This is particularly relevant in terms of exposing corruption. Obviously, the highest price is paid by those journalists who lose their life. I think there really has to be a mechanism that is independent and is established, that looks into any kind of a crime against a journalist, and that has to be because often it happens in a jurisdiction where there is no real recourse, where you know that even on some level this has been approved by the state, and that there's no recourse within the state. So there needs to be external pressure, and that's a really powerful tool. And I think that that's something that can be set up in advance of something happening, so that when it happens, it's already in place and it can be called upon to lead that kind of investigation. The more insidious and lesser seen problem we face is a more everyday problem, and that is on a legal front, and that happens really around the world, and I've seen it here in the UK, in South Africa, in Germany, in France, really in many places. And that is the legal restrictions that are imposed on journalists. Gianluca made the very good point that earlier, that journalists really have to be held to account as well. And that we all agree with that. We have to conduct ourselves properly. We should stand up to scrutiny ourselves. You know, no one has a quarrel with that. Media regulation is an important component. But at the moment, the balance is very far on the wrong side of this. For example, in the UK, just to point to one example, the way the courts are ruling on privacy is extremely restrictive. So what it ultimately means is that you're restricted from writing about individuals who face very serious and very credible allegations of corruption. And the problem with this is that while there is no exposure in the press, they're very free to continue with whatever behavior they're doing. You will probably be aware of the example in Germany where reporters from the Financial Times were being investigated for market manipulation in connection with the Wirecard scandal. It is interesting that a regulator in Germany's first instinct is to investigate the journalist and not the multi-billion-dollar company that has now been acknowledged to have been running a massive multi-billion-dollar fraud. These are the issues. Each country has very specific and very detailed restrictions. There is no real blanket answer to this. But the key thing that runs throughout every country is that journalists require protection. Journalists require their sources to be protected. We've had several instances in the US, for example, where journalist sources have been exposed. They have no protection. They they become the subjects of lawsuits and criminal trials themselves. And this is something that really is something that means that corruption continues to get covered up. And I noticed this when we talk to sources, colleagues talk to sources. It is something that ultimately will continue to weaken journalists' ability to function. I want to leave it at that, but if there are questions, I'm very happy to deal with those. Thanks.
Thank you so much, dear Franz. Well, I know cases as well that instead of going after the information and verifying and checking the information, they go after the whistleblower or after the journalists, and this is a disgrace. And usually governments, they do this in order to silence journalists and whistleblowers as well, to frighten people. Thank you indeed for your speech. I'm truly amazed by what your network accomplished and fascinated by the investigations you conducted. This is investigative journalist at its very best. Thank you. Dear Marco, I will now give back to you the floor for facilitating the debate among all interested participants. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here with us today.